who are here today to learn and to listen from our researchers, I really do encourage you to follow up and get in contact with our researchers if they're doing something that's of interest to you personally, to an organization that you represent. If you're working on that issue at the policy level right now, these are the people who can help you. They are ready, they are willing, they have solutions, and they have the research to back up their arguments, which is so important for the entire policy making process. So if there's one of the researchers mentioned something that you find interesting today, please follow up, check out our researchers' profiles on the DARE website, make sure you get in contact with them. If you're there in person, definitely grab that researcher for a coffee. People are only too happy, especially after the last 2 years of quite a lot of isolation, to have the opportunity to actually connect with people and to put the research that they have been working on all this time to good use, and to think about other potential applications of that research, because perhaps something somebody says today could be relevant in quite a different area that you're working on. So do engage and do ask questions. The researchers are there, they're willing to work with others, and it's really important for researchers to think about and be encouraged to develop their arguments in a way that can create real and lasting change. And I know that those of you who are attending today are the kinds of people who can do that. I also just want to acknowledge the really important work that has led to this event, without which we would not be here today. And this particular event, and in fact, the entire week leading up to today's conference, has been really carefully crafted and organized by Lisa Waddington at the University of Maastricht and the European Disability Forum, especially Anne-Sophie. But I'm so grateful to all of those who are putting the event together in person. It is a real logistical challenge to develop an event like this that has some online participation as well as the in-person elements in a way in which everyone can actually participate, and in a way that's not frustrating for people and that minimizes the technical challenges that we're all facing. So this is really, really great to have an event like this pulled off, and it is not an easy feat. And again, also very grateful to the backroom team in NUI Galway, especially Joanna Ford and Mary Faherty, who have been so central in working with Raquel and Anne-Sophie and everyone at EDF to make today's event happen. I also want to acknowledge, in terms of the accessibility of this event, the stellar work of our captioners and sign language interpreters, and also to encourage everyone throughout the day to engage in the event, whether by asking questions in person, for those of us who are participating online, to make sure that we are posting questions in the chat so that they can be read out, or we have the opportunity to ask our question to the presenters, because again, this is our chance. These are the opportunity that the early stage researchers have been working really hard towards in order to make sure that they can actually share their findings with the world and share their research with the world. So we really need to make the most of this opportunity, engage with the researchers, and for the early stage researchers as well, to make sure to use this networking opportunity to its fullest. So with that, I just want to make a final note of celebration, I hope, of what we have achieved in the project so far. And research is at such an advanced stage for all of our early stage researchers. Almost everyone has completed their data collection and is either in the midst of their analysis or about to undertake that analysis. And that's a really critical point. And it is no mean feat to collect information, especially from disabled people directly in the midst of a global pandemic. So the opportunities that people would normally have had for engagement have been completely flipped on their head. And I'm so proud of what the early stage researchers have managed to achieve by continuing to collect data in this really challenging environment in a way that is such a valuable information. And in fact, some people have collected information in the context of the pandemic that perhaps they would have never been able to collect otherwise. So this is a really crucial time. This is a really important time for advancing disability rights. We are still in a global pandemic, despite the fact that many states would like to pretend otherwise. And the health and lives, indeed, of disabled people are still at risk in many contexts, not just from factors like the global pandemic, but because of conflict, because of climate change. And these are issues which our early stage researchers are really deeply thinking about, are poised to engage with, and have the knowledge to really make a difference in those environments. So it's more important than ever that we ensure disability rights are part of the conversation about how to achieve justice in all of these different arenas. And while we're focused on the perspective of disabled people and disability rights in our conversations today, we need to make sure that we are also being included as researchers who work in this space in all the other conversations that are going on globally about justice and human rights issues. And that work is still ongoing. It still will take time for us to be fully invited to those tables or to muscle our way into them, but it's really important that we don't give up at this point. There is a real risk that some of the small concessions towards disabled people's lives and health and well-being and rights that were won during the pandemic, there's a real risk that those are going to be completely reversed. And this is a time that we need to focus on that and focus our energies on how we can really create a political case for change, a legal case for change, and a social case for change as well as a cultural one. So with that, I'm going to conclude my opening remarks and welcome everyone to today's conference. I'm sure we're going to have really productive conversations. I'm really looking forward to hearing from all of our early stage researchers, as well as the key respondents that have been selected, to give them feedback on their work and think about how their work can be applied in different contexts. But of course, first we have a very important keynote address to hear from Professor Jared Quinn, and I think we are still waiting for him. So I wonder if there are any general questions for me about the DARE network that anyone would like to ask at this point. We have a few minutes before Jared is actually with us. So if anyone would like to ask something about the DARE network, please do. Okay, so Yolin has asked a really important question in the chat, which is what happens after the conference? So good question. So our early stage researchers are going to continue to work on their projects, and their contracts for their research work go until the end of August this year, at which point they will be wrapping up their research with the DARE project. So we won't be having any further public events after today, but that is why I've mentioned that it's so important to get in contact with the individual researchers that are working on issues that are connected to you. And of course, you can also be in contact with any of the principal investigators that are leading the research at each of the partner universities and the core partners for this project. And we will continue to work on these issues. We are actually having a discussion tomorrow amongst the core partners about how we can advance the research after the end of the DARE project. So watch this space. This is something that is not going to go away, and we're thinking about plans of how we can progress these issues in the meantime. Joanne has asked a question about what is the best way to get involved. So I would suggest that the best way is really to check out our website. We will post the link to the website in the chat as well for people who are listening in. So our website will have all the information on the individual researchers, on their individual projects, and how to get in contact with them. So that's dareresearch.eu. And so that's really the best way to get involved. And there's a contact list there where you can also email dareresearch@nuigalway.ie to be informed about any publications or developments from the DARE project. Emma is asking a question on whether there is much research on disabled people in the workplace in Ireland. So I'm not sure if any of the early stage researchers want to respond to that. I'm not sure if that's something that anyone from the project is specifically working on. Although there have been people who've worked on issues related to the workplace, I don't think the focus has been on Ireland. So because I'm based there, I'm happy, Emma, to be in contact with you and provide you with any links and publications that I'm aware of that might be of interest. So perhaps that, but again, please, if any of the ESRs would like to share in research that they're aware of on disabled people in the workplace in Ireland, please let me know. Okay, I think Jared has just joined us. So I'm going to hand over the floor to Jared once you've managed to get your mic and camera working. And again, for those of you that perhaps missed the introduction I did earlier, so Professor Jared Quinn is a professor at the University of London and the University of Leeds, and was also centrally involved in that DREAM network that I mentioned earlier, of which he was the scientific coordinator. But he is probably best known to most of you as the UN Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. So we are very, very privileged and pleased that Jared is here to join us today and is going to share with us his thoughts on the future of research in this field. So over to you, Jared.
So thank you very much. My presentation this morning is titled Change and Disability, the Researcher as a Policy Entrepreneur. So it's a real pleasure to be really among the next generation of young researchers and hopefully aspiring change agents. I'm deeply grateful to Lisa Waddington for the invitation, and I readily accepted in part because of my admiration for her sterling contribution to change over the years. In her own inaugural address, she wrote eloquently about the march of an idea from the Treaty of Rome to the Treaty of Maastricht in a wheelchair. The journey she traveled in that inaugural address was from meager origins in the Treaty of Rome to much more promising normative departure points in the Treaty of Maastricht. What I want to do this morning is take you on a slightly different kind of journey. My chief concern today is what counts as change? Why is change so difficult, even when the evidence is overwhelming, and even when the normative departure points are crystal clear? To do that, I want to unpack two different spheres that may be considered markets in their own right, and then focus on the relationship between research and researchers and these markets. Of course, there are more than just markets, but let me stay with that metaphor, at least for the sake of this talk. First of all, there is the political marketplace, which responds in its own peculiar way to the felt needs of the people. There are many prisms through which issues get refracted, ignored, or made salient in that marketplace. There are many dynamics explaining change or lack of change in this marketplace. You need to know this marketplace and how it works, and your place within it as a researcher. Secondly, there is the policy marketplace, or the permanent government, which can be equally, if not more, resistant to change. We can condemn, but it's much better to understand. Often the political marketplace and the policy marketplace are not aligned, but when they are, great things can happen. Spoiler alert, I'm assuming a relatively open and responsive democratic order. That, of course, is not true everywhere in the world. You will have to adjust what I say to fit your own circumstances in whatever part of the world you come from. Not only can the political and the policy markets take a different shape depending on where you are, but culture often mediates universal norms. Still, I am an optimist, and I believe that openings for change do happen even in relatively closed political systems. You just have to be alert for them and ready to capitalize on them when they occur. And third, what about your strength, your forte, research, knowledge, data, and evidence? What is its relationship to change, to these two marketplaces, and to advocacy within and before them? The relationship between research, ideas, and change turns out to be very complicated. Disabuse yourselves of the idea at the outset that there are any self-executing treaties, directives, or other legal norms. Always remember the admonition of Justice Holmes that the life of the law is not logic, it is experience. Formal logic might point one way, but it's often mediated by other factors that courts, politicians, and policymakers simply assume. It's much harder to excavate these assumptions and then create a space for decision makers to feel comfortable abandoning them. One of the key lessons of the realists is that decision makers do not necessarily respond to cogent argumentation. You have to first want to make them want to decide for you. I think it's useful to travel this field before you begin your life's work and journey. Academic prowess is one thing, but the situation sense you need to move the dial is something else entirely. As you gain experience, you will pick this up, hopefully, but it's no harm to be aware of this before you begin your exciting life journey. So what about the political marketplace? What moves politicians? I want to zoom in on a few elements, and I'm sure there are many more. As a true marketplace, political parties and individual politicians compete for votes and power. Our hope is that this creates a discipline to think about the public interest rather than sectoral interests. But of course, we know that some parties favor some sectoral interests over others, and that's part and parcel of their identity and appeal to the public, or at least to some sectors of the public. Very few politicians are conviction politicians. Like political algorithms, they can sense trends even before they happen and adjust accordingly. Likewise, very few political parties reason deductively from core instruments like a constitution or a treaty. They constantly weave and respond to where they sense the public is going. So how to hail them on their channel? I isolate 6 elements, 6 ways in, but I'm sure there are many more. First of all, values. All political systems have their own traditions and grundnorms, legacy values. A good example is the centrality of equality in the French Republic. Another might be the desideratum for fairness in the UK. No party wants to be outmaneuvered when it comes to these core legacy values. It helps to be able to point to a treaty or a constitutional provision, but to reinforce native commitment to change, you need to also point to these legacy values. Of course, all systems have a degree of cognitive dissonance, professing one thing and then doing exactly the other with absolutely no sense of contradiction. I've often puzzled about this, and the only explanation I can find is that culture often trumps logic, even the logic of a legacy value. This gets back to the importance of narrative in framing the issues and the critical importance of configuring your research to crack open the existing narrative. A second way in to the politicians is through economics. Another way to reach them is through economic argumentation. I think it was James Carville who once said, "It's the economy, stupid," as a way of explaining voters' behavior and politicians' behavior in response. Politicians know instinctively that people will not vote for them if they feel worse off than before. Now, that's very useful up to a point. Never forget that the constitutional authority for the Americans with Disabilities Act was both the 14th Amendment, with its moral value of equality, and the Interstate Commerce Clause, working toward a more rational and efficient transborder national economy. Likewise, never forget that the logic of the internal market also sits alongside Article 13 of the Treaty of Amsterdam as providing authority for key EU legislative developments. Curiously, the economic argument does not always work in your favor, even when it should. For example, institutions are widespread in many countries. They're expensive, are a drain on the public resources, and are palpably inefficient in terms of human outcomes, and yet they persist. Another example, DG Regio continues to invest the hard-earned monies of ordinary European taxpayers in institutions, even though the great Jim Mansell showed that there were better solutions many years ago. What's going on? You're a politician, right? You don't want to be seen throwing people out of a job. And the cost of the existing situation, high though that may be, can be borne out of a fear that change will rupture the economic interests of an important group that actually votes. Others have suggested that corruption plays a part, although that's intrinsically difficult to establish. But maybe what's really going on underneath the surface is that economic arguments, no matter how well crafted, are always seen through a distorting prism. It's like economic arguments have traction sometimes, but not always. Quite where the dividing line is very hard to predict in advance. Reputedly, the John Major government sat on, that is to say, did not publish research that showed that making the preponderance of London underground stations accessible would pay for itself over a number of years. So economic arguments count, but they're not a killer argument for change. Still, be prepared to make the economic argument. Sam Begenstos claims that this was the argument that cemented the bipartisan support for the Americans with Disabilities Act, although this is contested by others. And be prepared for the reverse. The economics may not point to the solution you prefer or you consider warranted under treaty law or constitutional law, but have the strength of character to press for it regardless of economics. At the end of the day, human rights trumps economics, but politicians rarely see this. What about the unique moments opened up by scandals, of which there are many in the disability field? Politicians have an acute sense of how the public reacts to events, especially scandals and tragedies. These moments of crisis and self-doubt often create a temporary space for change. If you don't move fast, you will lose the momentum. You have to be prepared, and you have to have your blueprint for change ready before a crisis hits. Of course, crises can backfire spectacularly. I remember an episode in Ireland whereby our national TV did an expose of violent and inhumane conditions in an institution in a neighboring county. I did an appearance on national TV on it. I came out of the studio and had an informal chat with the cameraman. His reaction was the common reaction. We can surely do better regulating conditions in these places. It was not, hey, we actually have a national policy in place on deinstitutionalization that's not been implemented. Why not? And indeed, no matter how well regulated these places are, they're intrinsically prone to violence, exploitation, and abuse. I was shocked and taken aback, but I shouldn't have been. The space opened by scandal and the human reaction of pity can also be dominated by pity. The trick is to try and use the space opened by scandal and shock to engineer space for real change. The scandal and ensuring pity can exceptionally create the space, but should never be allowed to drive it. That's much easier said than done. You have to somehow use the moment of crisis to engineer a shift of narrative, but more of that later on. Also, never underestimate sheer accidents and be ready for them. A case in point, when Theresia Degener and I produced the Office of the High Commission study 20 years ago now on the need for a treaty, it was against the backdrop of a failed resolution in the Human Rights Commission to move forward toward a treaty. Rather, a draft resolution to that effect was presented, but was vetoed even before it got to the floor by 2 or 3 European states, which I won't name here. These states said it was too early, that the existing system should be given more time to work. The aim of our study was to show that the existing system did not work and could benefit from a new instrument. In truth, though, any new resolution based on the study to drive forward toward a treaty was also likely to fail since the opposition was deeply entrenched. Nobody, especially not Teresa nor myself, could have predicted that Mexico would short-circuit further debate by pushing through a resolution in the UN General Assembly to set up an ad hoc committee, and the rest is history. My point, accidents do happen. They create space for innovation. Don't hold back on your ideas for change. What is unthinkable today can suddenly become orthodoxy tomorrow. What about competition in the marketplace? All marketplaces have competitors. Often rival parties will focus on an issue like disability to both embarrass the governing party and burnish their own reputations. Equally, the governing party might move on an issue to deny oxygen to a rival party. Of course, the best is all party support for change, but that does not happen often. The Americans with Disabilities Act is a great example. Competitive political dynamics might work in your favor. However, a lot of care is needed. If you get too close to a rival party, thus enabling them to attack the government and make political capital, you may find yourself locked out of favor with the governing party. Say you craft a blueprint for new legislation and it's championed by an opposition party. Merely the fact that it is championed by an opposition party may doom it, despite its intrinsic worth. And if the governing party looks set to lock in place its majority, you'll be left out in the cold. Contrariwise, if you get too close to the governing party, then you can easily be portrayed and criticized for appeasing inaction. It's a very delicate game. My only advice is don't unnecessarily burn bridges. Make yourself equally available to all parties and try not to be seen as weaponizing one party over the other. Of course, every market has both a supply side and a demand side. On the demand side, the other interesting thing about the political marketplace is what the political sociologists call interest group articulation and interest group agitation. Politicians and political parties don't typically respond to individuals on the ground. More accurately, they don't typically formulate policy on the basis of individual experiences. These experiences are mediated through interest groups like organizations of persons with disabilities. And these interest groups also compete with each other. The theory about insular and discrete minorities posits severe disadvantages for many social groups who find it hard to form alliances with other groups and thus leverage change. The result is they don't have an impact commensurate even with their numbers. When you think about it, 15% of any given population has a disability. You'd expect to see a lot of legislation in the field, but that is not the case. Some disability groups have been highly disadvantaged by this, and sometimes they even fail to get the active support of other disability groups. And sometimes governments will play to the distinct interests of different groups and play them off against each other. Sometimes government will frame the arguments from interest groups like disability rights groups as just special pleading, as an attempt to hijack rights to advance special interests. This speaks to the need to build alliances, which takes a lot of mental energy and time. To me, at least, it speaks to the need to work more intersectionally. I've often marveled at how elder rights groups are still at a distance from disability rights groups. When you think about it, deinstitutionalization affects both. And this might lead to more sustainable policy solutions across identity boundaries. Probably the future is increasingly intersectional, and I only see that as a gain. The important point, though, is to reflect and take some time to reflect on the ecosystem for the demand side, how to anticipate how your positions might be spun by government, and to have a counter narrative ready, how to form alliances within the disability field, but also beyond it, how to overcome prejudice against discrete and insular minorities to ensure that your voice is heard, commensurate with the numbers involved. In short, tend to the ecosystem on the demand side and pay attention to this. So much for high politics. What about the real government, the permanent civil service, who often function as the key gatekeepers of change? Research conducted by the British Overseas Aid Office a few years ago investigated why, after a significant investment of several £100 million to a country, there had been little lasting impact. The surprising conclusion was that the policy narrative of the key policymakers had not changed. And it was this that accounted for the lack of movement. The result is that good money was funneled into a system without in any meaningful way reshaping the old policy narrative. They also came to the really interesting conclusion that senior policymakers tend to truly innovate only once over a long career of, let's say, an average of 30 years. Twice, maybe if you're lucky. They are inherently risk averse. Now, what we typically call for in the disability sphere is innovation, which means taking risks. When you think about it, the UNCRPD is a profound disruptor. The systems changes it envisages run deep, and why? That's why we celebrate the CRPD. To me, the important finding concerns the centrality of narrative. Two things to me dominate the controlling narrative almost everywhere in the world. First of all, there is the common assumption everywhere in the world that social support in the form of traditional social welfare is not only enough, but you should be thankful for it. When you unpack this, you can see how it subtly objectifies the person and accepts that a floor of material support is not only necessary, but also sufficient. Related to this is the dominant policy narrative, which says disability costs. So there's a tendency not even to reach the merits of the arguments for change. The cost paradigm operates as a curtain to pull across arguments for change and put them almost indefinitely on the defensive. And this is true even when the arguments for change are palpably cost effective. I recall the initial opposition of the EU to the concept of reasonable accommodation as a form of discrimination in the ad hoc committee in the drafting of the UN CRPD. They saw it, or at least they presented it, as an indirect way of making economic and social rights enforceable and therefore objectionable. Their initial position was impervious to logic. Thankfully, they changed, but that's another day's story. So in a way, persons with disabilities are caught in this trap of economic, social, and cultural rights. Put another way, these rights are distorted to justify arrangements that may provide support, but at the cost of marginalizing persons with disabilities. It seems that both disability and old age are disproportionately hit by this phenomenon, welfare and not rights. When you argue for enhanced social support, as you should, be careful not to reinforce the dominance of this policy welfare narrative. Related to the centrality and stubborn stability of dominant policy narratives is risk. The risks associating with existing law can be well known. Often policymakers know full well what these risks are and are actually content to remain with them, even though the exposure to human rights abuses remains palpable. For example, to be placed in a congregated setting inevitably means a heightened risk of violence, exploitation, and abuse. Maybe part of the reason for keeping people in institutions is allegedly protection. Yet it has often been shown time and again that the best form of protection is to have a friend. The risk of continuing with existing arrangements, like institutions, is in the policymaker's mind balanced against the risks of change. Change is always risky. It's an unknown unknown. The costs are unpredictable. The rupture to existing ways of doing things will discomfort many. Why create enemies? It creates the risk of a spillover. Other groups might be emboldened to demand change. This is something that we celebrate, but that policymakers don't celebrate. Policymakers fear losing control of the agenda. Again, you and I celebrate this, but policymakers don't. So if the policy narrative is the key to true change, to lasting, sustainable change, how do you change that? You stand some chance to persuade the policy gatekeeper to innovate if he or she has political cover from the political branches. This assumes a minister committed to change. This commitment might either come from conviction or from political calculation. But if it is there, then the innovation-minded policymaker can use it to advantage. There will be mistakes, but at least there will be political cover. And you also stand some chance of success if you can show that the new framework, though unfamiliar, promises better outcomes as well as a more rational use of public resources. And that's where comparative research proves highly worthwhile. I digress for a moment. It seems that dominant policy narratives have their own half-life. That is to say, they decay slower than the pace of legislative change. An obvious case in point were the many negative policy reactions during COVID-19, as revealed by the outstanding Disability Rights Monitor report in 2021. So even when there's positive legislative developments, the dominant policy narrative continues and helps explain many negative policies that impacted persons with disabilities during COVID. Systems always revert to type, and it's even blatantly obvious during crises. So changing the dominant policy narrative is not necessarily done by enacting positive legislation. That's only one step and is not necessarily the decisive one. Changing the policy narrative is a long game. It means you have to consciously configure your research and advocacy to chip away at the dominant framework and put in place an alternative framework, one that will stand the stress of time. So now, lastly, we come to you, the knowledge workers of the future. By now, you'll understand that change is complex, there are many moving parts, and it does not necessarily respond to rational argumentation, or at least not directly. I think there are important lessons for how you should approach your future as knowledge workers. First of all, in the past, a lot of disability research focused on explicating reality, and typically through quantitative analysis. Nothing intrinsically wrong at that. However, the dominant policy narrative always has a way of distorting the messages to be derived from that research, even though that's not your intention. Detailed exposés of what is can easily be distorted into an understanding and acceptance of what ought to be, the classic naturalistic fallacy. If quantitative research is your forte, or if you're using quantitative research to augment more policy-oriented research, then think about how you can guard against the naturalistic fallacy and foreground your vision for the future. There's a lot of talk these days about evidence-based policy making. In my experience, the evidence can count and can count most when decisions have already been taken on other grounds to change. That's not to say evidence is irrelevant. You can't do without it. And if you don't have it, it can be used against you as a pretext to delay change. All research work rests on often unarticulated presumptions. Try to bubble them to the surface. Remember that even famous legislative breakthroughs can be sidelined if the dominant policy narrative persists. Everything you do will either support or undermine the dominant policy narrative. Whether you like it or not, you are a participant in the half-life of these narratives. Your advocacy strategy, how you put your research to work, should keep one eye on the gain you seek to make, for example, an inclusive education law, and another eye on nudging the narrative forward. Remember that the legislation on its own won't necessarily do this. Don't be afraid to lay down for the basis for a completely new policy and narrative. Remember, crises and accidents do happen and create the oxygen for a switch in narratives. Don't just challenge exclusion and segregation. Challenge the suppositions that make it acceptable in the eyes of some. For example, the cameraman in my TV interview. Avoid legal formalism. 3 sins of legal formalism were highlighted by the realists many years ago. The first was conceptualism, the idea that legal ideas are comprehensive and extend to absolutely every single eventuality. The second was the idea that rules are complete unto themselves, entirely self-referencing. And the third was that formal logic alone could generate one right answer. The core point is that most law opens up deliberative space, does not close down deliberative space. There are very few single right answers in law, either in constitutional law or under treaties. There's mainly argumentative space. which is usually a decided advantage compared to what preceded it. It's tempting to be a legal formalist, to assert that there is one right answer, especially when the existing situation appears intolerable. However, to insist on this, you can play into a trap. Politicians, and especially policymakers, hate it when you press an argument that short circuits the normal democratic process, that trumps the political and policy marketplaces. And this is true regardless of the merits. Most treaties contain constructive ambiguities, even at their core, that create space for open-ended balancing tests. After all, most of the rights in the CRPD are secured on an equal basis with others, whatever that means. So in a way, a treaty or a constitution creates space for deliberative reason. It's a space with a difference because it grounds a completely different policy narrative. But no treaty is ever self-executing. Always be aware that the CRPD is a profound disruptor and flows directly against the prevailing policy narrative. Your job really is to flesh out that new policy narrative and to make it steadily more credible. Try to avoid advocacy that suggests there's one right answer or that a treaty provision dictates an outcome. Try instead to present your research as a contribution to building a new policy narrative on the assumption that your system of governance has committed to change since it's ratified the relevant treaty. In this, at least, I am a follower of Ryan Goodman, who views international law less as a series of categorical imperatives and more as a stimulus to motivate and nudge states toward right behavior. The future, of course, is not to do work for, but to do work with civil society. Partly this goes to the very legitimacy of your research work, and partly it goes to the effectiveness of your research work. When Bob Bergdorf wrote the first draft of the ADA in the mid-1980s, which he did in his spare time, he did it in close cooperation with disability groups. This was one of the main reasons it was endorsed by the US National Council of Disability in the late 1980s, thus paving the way for the landmark legislation. This places a premium on models of co-production of research with civil society, as well as on research ethics when working in close collaboration with civil society. The days of the isolated researcher working away in an ivory tower are over. This calls for new skills and especially active listening. This might generate some tensions for you. After all, this kind of work product generated through co-production is not really what universities, for example, typically reward. I had high hopes for the trend toward rewarding work for its impact within universities, but impact analysis in research at universities has just become reified and therefore just another matrix. At the end of the day, you have to do this work because you believe in it and not because it leads to career advancement. By now, you'll understand you're part of a larger ecosystem for change. By now, you'll understand that each side of the equation has its own calculus to make. By now, you'll understand that motivating all sides to work forward is key. To some extent, that requires you making calculations for each side, even before they make them for themselves. This is key to the situation sense you need as a researcher to advance change. The best way to do this, to pick up the skills needed to do this, is to step into the shoes of the different sides. The idea that there's one unilinear career that you must follow, for example, in academia, is not helpful. Be open to spending time in government. There's no magic line separating good guys from bad guys. Be open to spending time working in advocacy organizations. Active listening becomes a natural default when you do. Spend time working in an NHRI or on a treaty body. They will force you to translate majestic generalities into practical lines of reform. The acuity of your research product will be greatly enhanced by these experiences, not diminished. What are my conclusions? And I will be very brief. First of all, the dominant policy narrative is the superstructure to change, guiding it, deflecting it, and informing it. You should always have one eye on it whilst advocating for a particular law or policy reform issue. Remember, unless it's changed, the dominant policy narrative can swamp even progressive laws, and especially in times of crisis. This is a long game, but one you should always be part of and configure your research to be part of. Secondly, your opportunities to put ideas into action depends on many, many variables, and not just on the intrinsic worth of the ideas. Don't wait, always anticipate openings for change and be ready for them when they happen. As Lisa Waddington, Tracy Degader, and I can testify, they happen in very surprising ways. Third, avoid legal formalism. Try to present your ideas as a contribution to deliberative reason, as an honest attempt to advance change in the policy narrative. Be open to the counter-argument that you could be wrong. Prowess has to be tempered by humility. Finally, try to circulate in your future career. Universities are a part of the world as well as apart from the world. They are at their very best when they allow for and facilitate active research citizenship. See your career as part of the larger democratic ecosystem for change and find ways to be connected. Life is short, but I think if you do this, then you're much more likely to leave some valuable lines in the sand. Thank you so much, Eleanor, and back to you.
Thank you, Jared. That was so interesting, and I'm sure really beneficial for our early stage researchers as they embark on a future research career. So I'm going to take some questions that we have on Zoom in the chat first and pose them to you, Jared, and then we'll take a round of questions from those who are in person in the room. So the first question we have in the chat comes from Paul, and he asks, are we sometimes missing the intersectionality of power as an area for analysis? For example, the directive proposal in 2008 intended to level up EU protection against discrimination based on age, disability, sexual orientation, and religion or belief beyond the workplace. Article 13 in the Amsterdam Treaty resulted largely from different interest groups working together. The 2008 proposal has languished since 2008. Is that partly the failure of civil society interest to see the potential of the intersectionality of power, or is the proposal not sufficiently important? So, Jared, I'll put that question to you first because it's quite an extensive one.
Thank you, Paul. What a great question and lots of fascinating.
It's also an easy question.
Yeah. You know, I think maybe we can trace it even further back. I think when we had the Article 13 of the Treaty of Amsterdam, we had a chance to move forward on a united front, but a decision was taken to, first of all, have a race directive, which was really good and spanned many different material fields. And then to separate that out from a directive narrowly telescoped into employment, covering all of the remaining fields. So there was a kind of implicit aristocracy embedded from the get-go. I do recall, and maybe if Lisa is online, she will recall also, that there was a proposal in the 90s to break down the different units, or rather thread together the different units in DG employment to create an equal opportunities directorate. And that was actually strenuously opposed by the gender unit on the basis that that might debase the currency. So I think we played into that in exactly the wrong way from the 1990s. And I think governments obviously play up to that and play between that. It did create some interesting debate in the United States in the 1980s and the 1990s about whether there should be an extension of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 to embrace disability within its coverage, or to have an entirely separate set of legislation. They were lucky enough that they had very strong bipartisan political support to get a very robust piece of legislation. We've not been so fortunate. So I don't know, but it's really worthwhile having a separate seminar and thinking that through, Paul. Thank you very much for the question.
Great. Thanks, Jared, for that answer. I'm going to go next to the room, to the in-person room, and ask my colleagues there if anyone has a question. I think there's a roving microphone coming its way to you if anyone wants to ask Jared a question.
Yes. Hi, Jared. Colin Kaki from NEI Galway. Just wondering, you mentioned about the rights of older people, and I was wondering if you had any views on the proposed development of a new convention on the rights of older people, and whether you had any advice for disability researchers as to whether we should be reaching out to those people advocating for that convention to see if there's maybe a third way.
Thanks, Colin. And one of the people I work extremely closely with is Claudia Mahler, the UN Special Expert or Advisor on the Rights of Older People. When we started drafting the CRPD, it was a standing possibility that people in the CRC community, in the CERD community, in the CEDAW community could have objected to the very commencement of the process on the basis that their instruments might be debased. They didn't do that. They had the openness of mind to give a fair wind to the process for drafting the Disability Convention. And I think the Disability Convention suggested many innovations, some of which have been implicitly taken on board by the other treaty monitoring bodies. So to the argument that we cannot allow a treaty on the rights of older people to proceed because it potentially creates the risk of debasing the currency, I would say we need to have the same openness of mind that others had in allowing a fair wind for the drafting of the UN CRPD itself. I think there are many, many interesting similarities or commonalities between ageism and ableism. I also think there are some differences, but that's what a specialist treaty drafting process is there for, to try and weasel out what the commonalities are and what the differences are. The two things that seem to me that underpin both instruments, and now I'm being very optimistic and anticipating an instrument on the rights of older people, is notions of autonomy. And of course, when you peel that away, what we're really talking about is not viewing the old age or the disability first, but viewing the person behind it first. And that's one of the commonalities between ableism and ageism, that it acts as a kind of a cloaking device that indecently conceals the person. And the other commonality, it seems to me, is community living, being connected with the community, not hiding away as you age and so forth. But and it's been shown again and again and again that anytime you institutionalize, let's say, an older person, their health condition, such as it was, accelerates and deteriorates even more rapidly than what would otherwise be the case. And that's why in some countries I know, there's no institutions for people with dementia, none. And that's extremely positive, but it cuts against the grain of the dominant policy narrative. So I guess both instruments would be trying in their own way to give us some tools to chip away at both ableism and ageism. So yeah, having said that, I think we were extremely lucky in the disability sector that Mexico rode in like a knight in shining armor in 2001, 2002. There is no Mexico as of yet getting behind the draft treaty or the proposal for a draft treaty on the rights of older people. I would personally love to see a larger Latin American country, perhaps a European country, but maybe even an Asia Pacific country, but we don't have that yet. So it's still a work in progress. And I think the future is very much an intersectional future. When you think about it, and I'll shut up here, there are so many issues that transcend these traditional identity boundaries. And sometimes we shoot ourselves in the foot by remaining hermetically sealed within these boundaries. We might have a chance of securing a lot more sustainable policy solutions if we argued for a conception of flourishing as a person in the community for all and not just for persons with disabilities. That would, of course, apply to older people, but perhaps others as well. Yeah, let me shut up there.
Thanks, Jared. We have two more questions from the Zoom, and I'll give them one after the other. I think the two people would like to ask the question live. So I'll turn to Joanne first for your question.
Hi, Jared. Thank you so much for your presentation. It was really interesting and very informative. In all of that, do you think we should work toward getting the CRPD in domestic law by existing legislation or a new bill?
Great. And while you're thinking of your answer to that, Jared, I'll give Emma the floor to ask her question.
Hi.
Go ahead, Emma.
Okay, sorry. Hi, Jared. My name's Emma. I'm currently studying. I'm an intellectual disability nurse, and I am doing a master's in disability studies in UCD. Now, I have a mild learning disability, so I was told as a person with a mild learning disability I wasn't able to practice as a nurse in Ireland. There was no support for it. Now, it's something just very minor, but I just hope this doesn't. Is there like? I have wrote to several different places in Ireland about, there's not enough support. Like, I only have a mild learning disability. It's something very minor, but I suffer a lot of discrimination in the workplace. Like, and I've wrote everywhere, been in every door, and got no answers or no support in any way.
Thanks, Emma. So over to you, Jared. Oh, you're on mute. You'll have to take your microphone off.
Sorry about that, modern living. Thanks, Joanne. I mean, it's a step forward to enshrine CRPD in domestic legislation, for sure. But I always remember, and I'm sure Paul remembers too, the work of Carol Clare, the very famous labor lawyer in the US. He took the example of the fair employment legislation of the 1930s, which put forward a radically different conception of employer-employee relationships gradually interpreted away by the courts, because of course the courts hadn't shifted to a different policy narrative. They continued with the traditional way of viewing the relationship, even though the legislation was on the books. So I think the legislation is a start, but it's really the dominance of the policy narrative that you have to work at. And unless you change that, you're not going to change much. By the way, there's going to be a natural lag between, let's say, a positive change in the narrative in the legislature and then a slower pace of change of the narrative in the courts. The courts naturally lag behind. So one of your tasks as an advocate is to make judges much more comfortable with the foundations of and the entailments of the new policy narrative. So that's taking a very strategic view of your role, so to speak. Emma, I'm very sorry to hear that. I do recall some famous cases in the United States. For example, I'll give you a shocking example, maybe. His name escapes me at the moment. You know, the blind singer from Detroit. Anyhow, I'll think of his name.
Stevie Wonder?
Stevie Wonder. Stevie Wonder has a pilot's license. Now he has a pilot's license with the reasonable accommodation that a seeing pilot accompanies him in the small Cessna plane that he flies. There are many, many blind psychiatrists in the United States, people who go through medical school, even though the medical schools try to keep them out because they can't see the patient, and therefore it is judged that their clinical capacities are somewhat less than seeing doctors, although they would argue that they more than compensate for this in other ways. And I've tackled the European Commission on its highly medicalized tests for employment that seem to go on fishing expeditions that lock people out of employment positions simply because they have a condition or a disability, without really looking at the relationship between that condition and disability and your actual capacity to perform the essential functions of a job. Now, I think, Paul, that's where we made a mistake in the drafting of the EU Employment Directive. We did not insist on this concept of the essential functions of a job, and therefore the scope for employers to discriminate is broader than it should be, allowing for open-ended medical testing. I think this is a hangover from a very narrow policy narrative that goes back 60 or 70 years, which simply assumes that if you have a disability, you have no place in doing certain jobs. So I think what you raise is a symptom of that. And I think one of the solutions is to either argue under the directive, bring a case before the European Court of Justice and get them to insist.
How do I do that? Because I've tried sending letters everywhere. And I can't get anywhere. Like the ministers or everything, they just close the door in my face.
Yeah. I mean, another example of it in Ireland, not to be too parochial, is that at least until recently, to become a national school teacher, there had to be a positive assertion that you were free from any sort of a disability, which is atrocious when you think about it. But let's have a bilateral chat later on it.
Great, thank you, Jared. So we'll go back to the in-person attendees in the room now and see if there are any remaining questions for Jared before we wrap up this session. So I think a microphone is on its way.
Kinvera County, Galway. Can you hear me, Jared?
Yes, but Jared's on mute now.
Jared's back on mute. Okay. Jared, since you're a visionary, I'm going to ask you a visionary question. As you may be aware, political scientists like Ivan Kastov in the Institute of Liberal Strategies, I think, in Sofia, Bulgaria, and many others are now suggesting that the liberal democracies are in decline, and that illiberal autocracies in the East, with China showing the fact that free market principles can easily be mapped onto autocracy and flourish very successfully. And in, of course, Eastern Europe as well, with Hungary and Poland and other countries, that in fact, the very principles of egalitarian liberal democracy and self-governance in a multi-sectorial, multiracial environment, those things are under threat. Very strong tectonic shocks are being sent around the world. In light of those kinds of forces, should disability researchers go local and let all of the enormous, potentially global changes play themselves out because they're completely beyond the scope of their activism? Or is there a role to play for all equality seekers, marginalized individuals, to sort of make stands with respect to very basic principles, which we didn't have to in our youth? Arguing for democracy didn't seem to be a necessary precondition for equality. It may now be that the very principles of self-governance may be under threat. So how would you, as a visionary, advise the ESRs?
So, I've always taken the view that in terms of marriage between liberalism and democracy, by far the weakest variable is the concept of democracy, because it can be understood simply as a process, simply as an open-ended process, simply as a process without limits, and also as a process that dominates other sources of values, like, for example, liberalism or whatever. And that kind of anomic view of democracy is the real problem. And it seems to be in the ascendant. And I think one of the problems is we've kind of fallen into several traps. And one is to underplay the kind of threads that connect the various groups that are the beneficiaries of equality. The prime beneficiary of equality is everybody in the country, not just particular sectoral groups. And we've never made that argument. And also, we've divided ourselves unnecessarily. For example, it seems to me profoundly stupid to argue for deinstitutionalization of people with disabilities without taking an equal interest in the deinstitutionalization of older people. So it's like it's forcing us to reframe what we mean by equality, how we break down some of these perceived hermetic seals between different identity groups, and then how we argue for democracy as a core value without which democracy itself could not function. So to me, there was a great publication last year by NOMOS, the American Society for Political Philosophy and Law, on democratic failure. And I think this is one of the key elements of that. And I'd love to chat with you further, Jerome and Kinvara, at your leisure.
Wonderful. Okay, well, due to time, we're going to have to leave that as our last comment from you, Jared. And thank you so much for spending this time with us today and sharing your insights with the researchers and with, of course, our public audience as well as part of this conference. So we really very much appreciate having you with us. And I'm sure people will be able to follow up with you in your role as UN Special Rapporteur if there are queries that they have that your office might be able to assist with in that. So I might just post the office email into the chat as well for anyone who wants to follow up with at the UN Special Rapporteur's office. But for now, we will be taking a short break. For those of you who are attending session 1A on ensuring accountability for duty bearers, you will be returning to this exact Zoom session. So you can, if you're listening online, just turn off your camera and mic for a while and come back in 20 minutes, 30 minutes, in 30 minutes time. And if you are attending session 1B, so that is the session on access to justice and persons with disabilities, you have to go to a different link, and I'm going to post that link into the chat now so that anyone who is listening online will know where to go. You have already received it in an email, but just in case you haven't got easy access to that, I'm posting the link for that now. So thank you once again to Jared and to all of our participants for a really lively session to kick off our public day. And we will be back in 30 minutes.